The Great Train Robbery continued. Far too many police investigations have been marred by fabricated evidence. So where does that leave the main event? History does rely on its recorder for accuracy, and accuracy relies on interpretation. So one cannot escape from the interpretation of police and writers, but it's the testing of what has been said over a prolonged period that may take us nearer to the truth. It has been suggested that each new study tends to ask more questions than it answers, which only shows there are still questions to be asked. I don't claim this book is intended to be the final word on the Great Train Robbery. I don't think that will ever be said. The venue, Buckinghamshire, is northwest of London, and following the Second World War, it consisted of both rural and urban areas. To the north the country was rural, but at its southeastern border it joins Greater London and Middlesex, so is more commercialised and carries far more of the population. The county town in Aylesbury, which lies 40 miles from London, the county is around 720 square miles, and by the 1960s the population close to 500,000. This was growing with the post-war London overspill, which saw Buckinghamshire become popular and new town of Milton Keynes grow. To look after the population there was a Buckinghamshire Constabulary, whom had a modern headquarters in Aylesbury and an establishment of 716 officers, of which 536 were of the rank of sergeant and below. At night time the total number of officers was only 55, of which the most senior was a sergeant, but the adequacy of this is borne out by the crime rate. However, during 8th August 1963, crime was committed, which all 55 officers would soon learn about, and their 660-odd colleagues, their civilian support workers and the entire population of Buckinghamshire, together with the rest of the country and a vast number of people worldwide. As soon as the press heard about the crime, it got a title, The Great Train Robbery. But in rural Buckinghamshire that night the 55 officers, even sergeants and 48 constables, were content to protect the public, and, as far as I can gather, apart from the train raid little else happened. They covered 5 divisions: Aylesbury, Bletchley, Chesham, High Wycombe, and what was known as the Slough Division. This was considered adequate, and if there was a major disaster there was what was known as the Mutual Aid Plan to put into operation. This meant the team could grow by another 135 officers up to the rank of chief inspectors in short notice, and this could be again inflated by the availability of a further 260 officers within 5 hours. There were military personnel available too. The only problem with this plan was the interpretation of the term major disaster, and most folk saw it as an event which included a major loss of life. Later, of course, it was to include a major crime. Although crime was on the increase generally, upon Buckinghamshire the figures for 1963 showed a 7% increase from 1962, but the rate of detective crime remained the same of 52%. The Chief Constable of Leeds said in 1966 that in his city only a third of crimes were solved. So under the Chief Constable, Brigadier John Cheney, the Assistant Chief Constable George Wilkinson, and the head of CID, Detective Superintendent Malcolm Fortrell, crime in Buckinghamshire was no worse than in the rest of the country, and better than in some areas. The divisions mentioned above were further subdivided, and within the Aylesbury division was the Linslade subdivision, which was broken further down to 6 beats. The total establishment for this subdivision in 1963 was an inspector assisted by 2 sergeants and 10 constables. A car with a radio was the main vehicle, but there were also 4 motorcycles which were not equipped with radios. In those days, communications between officers and stations were not nearly so sophisticated as they were today, and often once an officer was out on his beat, Then he was largely alone, though he had a whistle and there were police boxes, and he would meet his sergeant at a prearranged time and place. Kind note: the criminals who carried out the Great Train Robbery obviously knew the beats of the officers, the number of officers, and which area and which direction they would be traveling. So here you have, there was a police box. The money that was it left in a police box? This is the question I ask. And also, it is the opposite direction of other money that may have been left by the criminals so they can pick it up later, other than the beat these officers were on. The subdivision covered roughly 68 square miles. So the criminals who carried out the Great Train Robbery knew that you covered 68 or so square miles, and about 13,000 souls were resident. There were over 200 farms and small holdings and 2 disused RAF airfields, a fairly common feature of the landscape in those days. So from 200 farms, these criminals chose the farm that they were on. However, if there were 200 of these farms and they chose only one must question excuse me. One must question, why did they choose just the one farm? So the money could have been spread into, like, say, 50 of these farms. However, there were 200, or maybe 3 of the farms. Also common before the contemporary review of the railway network under Dr. Beeching were railway lines. In the Linslade subdivision was the main London to Glasgow railway line, which fortunately managed to avoid Dr. Beeching's cuts. This line passed through 12 miles of the subdivision, and there was a station at Cheddington. So here at Cheddington, they could have... I've not read the book, and I'm not too sure about the complete history of the Great Train Robbery, but they may have left money at these other stations, like Cheddington and so forth. The subdivision is broken down into beats, and it was the Cheddington beat that saw the robbery. The beat hosted 4 miles of track to the east of the village. Cheddington station wasn't staffed over the 24 hours and closed after the last train in the evening until the start of the following day's travel. The criminals obviously knew this. Overnight in the station, something like £2 or £3 was kept, and security was adequate, bearing this in mind. The train was known as the Glasgow to Euston Travelling Post Office, TPO, sometimes called the Up. Special trains travelling towards London are referred to as Up trains. Those travelling away are Down, or the Up Postal. It travelled through the night, originating in part in Glasgow, where it left at 6:50 p.m. on 7th August 1963. It stopped 28 miles south of Carstairs, where the original coaches were joined by others, and when it crossed the border and stopped at Carlisle, even more were added. These coaches had come down from the north-east of Scotland. Thereafter the train travelled south, with no other coaches joining. So if nobody got on after these trains after they joined, the robbers were already on the train, as far as I've read the book. It was solely for post. No freight or passengers were carried. The train comprised 12 coaches hauled by a diesel engine manned by a driver and a fireman. In the days of steam engines, the fireman had a more defined role, and eventually the title second man was adopted, but fireman was a term that was reluctant to die out. The only other railway employee on the train was the guard, who was usually in rearmost coach, so the remainder of the men on the train were General Post Office employees, so they were called. The train was due to arrive at Euston Station, London, 3:59 a.m. on 8th August. To most railway travellers, a journey is punctuated by a number of different things: the point at which the newspaper pages turned, or the passing of the major towns, or the point where the train always jolts to wake up sleeping passengers. Occasionally trains pass changing landscapes where someone has run up to the Bowl, or a new car has joined the acreage of its dismantled cousins. For railwaymen, it's different. Every stretch of track has some kind of name or reference. Each signal is its own personality. It's true that one green light is much the same as the other, but each signal, gantry or pole has its own unique identity. Some bridges have names, some are famous, but others were mere numbers. But for the train crew and signalmen, these areas are important. The track or road, as parlance would have it, is split into sections. Each section has a signalman to ensure the safe and speedy passage of the train. He knows the train is due, and the signalman for the previous section will notify him that it's coming. If all is clear, then his sets of signals can be set to safe to let the train through. The signals are two identities, the distant and the home, and like anything else, there is a possibility of malfunction, and there is a procedure to follow when this happens. Moving trains from one point to another means for the train crew motion and for the signalman safety, and if there is malfunction, then their train crew and signalman talk. For the signalman and train crew to talk, one of the train crew has to leave the cab of the train and approach the signal pole or gantry, where there is a telephone to the signalman. There are times when a fault will make a signal show red or danger and the driver can't proceed, but if the signalman says the light is set to green, then it highlights a fault in the system. The driver is given clearance to proceed and the signalman can report the fault.